I, like many other people, was deceived by the gap theory. Now, even if you're not particularly interested in the gap theory, but you might be interested in other people becoming undeceived by this doctrine, please give this video a like to give it some legs on YouTube so the people that need to see it will see it. And also, I encourage you, even though this gets pretty technical, keep going deeper into this video so that you can see how the exegetical process works, and also to see how a expert Hebrew scholar can sometimes use the Septuagint to illustrate what's going on in the Hebrew text. I hope you enjoy this. The gap theory, the idea that between verses 1 and verse 2, there's a long gap, and instead of translating it, and the earth was formless and void, it became formless and void. Some people will attach that to like the rebellion of Satan, et cetera, et cetera. Could you speak into that view?
Sure. Yes. Well, the Hebrew is beautiful here. I mean, this is a case where you can say, okay, the Hebrew grammar is the key point, and the misunderstanding of Hebrew grammar is a key point here. In verse 1, we have, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Bereshith bara Elohim, eth hashamayim wa eth haaretz. Verse 2 begins where verse 1 ended. Verse 1 ended with weh haaretz, the earth, or with the earth, not weh haaretz, just haaretz. And verse 2 begins with weh haaretz, and the earth. So you have a hinge there. It's a hinge between verse 1 and verse 2. The way that verse 1 ends, verse 2 begins. But it begins with a little conjunction there. The Hebrew letter, the wow, attached to the front of the Hebrew word for the earth, haaretz, is part of the key. That you have this wow conjunction attached to the noun, not the verb. The verb hayatha is the second word in verse 2. Why is that occurring? Well, that's what we call in Hebrew a disjunctive clause, where your wow conjunction is not attached to the verb. And in this case, it is usually providing background information. It's a parenthetical statement further describing what has been just said. So in essence, it's pausing, put a parenthesis around verse 2, and saying, okay, when God created the heavens and the earth, this is what the earth was like. It was empty. Actually, it was formless and empty. It was formless and empty, tohu wavohu. So it's, and that word there, hayatha, is the Hebrew. The Hebrew has two different forms of Hebrew verbs, perfect and imperfect. That's ignoring participles and imperatives, I know. But the two basic verb forms are perfect and imperfect. The perfect form of the verb oftentimes has to do, especially if you have a verb that is a stative verb, a verb that is about being something. The perfect has the idea of being. The imperfect has the idea of becoming. Now we have a perfect example of this in the way the Septuagint translates it, because the Septuagint is very careful that anytime the verb haya in Hebrew, the verb for be in Hebrew, is in the imperfect, it primarily uses a form of the Greek genomai. Genomai is not the same as the Greek eimi. Eimi is I am. It's the stative that is continuing, and genomai is become, becoming, being and becoming, and they distinguish that. So what do they do here? Do they translate as becoming? No, they don't. They use the exact same form of the verb. It's the verb ein. It's the imperfect form of eimi that is used in John 1:1. In the beginning was the Word. The Word didn't become or start in the beginning in John 1:1. The Word was in continual existence in the beginning. The Word was. And that's what we have here. And the earth was, not became. And so the Septuagint translators thoroughly understood and expressed what this was and how they took it. It is not as become. It was. In other words, that's the way it was when God created it. He created it that way. And it's not that suddenly there's a change in what God created. It's describing the parenthetical statement is to describe conditions of that heavens and earth that God had just created, and it focuses not on the heavens, but on the earth. Weha'aretz, hayata. And so that's there. And then the tohu wavohu. You can tell by the sound of it. It's a poetic sound. It's a pairing of two words that sound alike to make a point. And some take that as being a hendiadys, meaning that two words with one meaning only. I don't take it that way at all. We have to be very careful. Hendiasis found throughout Scripture do not necessarily always mean that there's one concept and only one concept. Sometimes the two are still kept separate. And in this context, they're going to be kept separate. In fact, it's part of the reason why some go to a framework hypothesis, because here you have it almost set out in advance that there are two different actions that God is going to proceed to take, because he's going to have to do something about the formlessness, and he's going to have to do something about the emptiness. And so the first 3 days are forming, and the next 3 days are for the filling. Now, I don't adhere to the framework hypothesis at all. There's a lot of problems with it. It says that those are not 6 consecutive days. It says the first day and the fourth day are really the same day or close to the same day. And the second and the fifth are the same, and the third and the sixth are the same. I don't see that at all. I see 6 consecutive days. I'll go back to the 10 Commandments again. There are 6 consecutive days. If the framework hypothesis were correct, the Sabbath would be observed every 3 days, or every 4 days, excuse me. 3 days of creation, fourth day of rest, because you have to pair up 1 and 4 and 2 and 5, etc. It doesn't work out that way. There's 6 consecutive days. But here we have a preview that says, okay, this earth that God has created has no form right now. It's just water. It's just water. And it's empty. There are no life forms. And so they're going to have to be filled. And so that's the focus of verse 2. And then that parenthesis ends at the end of verse 2. And then we go back and pick up in verse 3 what was started in verse 1 with, then God said, let light come into being. And that's interesting, because what does he say about the light? He says, Yahi or, Wayahi or, let there be light, and light came to be. In other words, there you have the imperfect of Haya that's become genomai in the Greek, which the Greek translators use genomai for. So they keep ami, the ain, the imperfect form, for hayatha in verse 2. And in the very next verse, verse 3, the imperfect form is genomai. It's a static stative versus the dynamic stative that you find. And that is how this plays out. So there's no room here for a gap in the way that this is described. And I've basically given you only about 2 or 3 reasons for it. But there are many more reasons. You can go on and on through this. I had a quote from Edward J. Young. Yes, in his studies in Genesis 1, part of this reason that the gap theory is taken here by some is that they've already taken verse 1 as a dependent clause rather than independent clause, saying when God created the heavens and the earth. There are some problems with that, even with the gap theory, because if it's when God created the earth became formless and empty. Why couldn't God control that? How could that happen? So they almost have to go to an independent clause for that. But he says this. He says a dependent clause, making it when God created the heavens and the earth, eliminates the doctrine of absolute creation from Genesis 1 by indicating a pre-existent earth. So sometimes that's part of what is involved in a gap theory, is also assuming a pre-existent earth that is an original creation. And so there's reasons why people have given up the gap theory. The arguments against it have been so strong that when it first appeared publicly in a popular format in the Schofield Study Bible, it was very popular in those days. But nowadays, hardly anyone talks about it because it has been so proven to be wrong. And one of the biggest reasons is Hebrew grammar. This is where Hebrew grammar really does form the argument, not vocabulary, but grammar.
Yeah, no, it's really good. I really appreciate you sharing that with us. And one of the reasons I became leery of it is I was reading it in some of these older sources, but it was hard to find anybody who was willing to defend it. Nowadays, who actually knew what they were talking about. It was easy to find a few popular people here and there, but people who actually understood Hebrew grammar, there was hardly anybody available to ask that.